listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. Today I'm joined by David Krulewich. He is the founder and CEO of Mission Media, as well as the founder of K Media Consultancy. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I hear everyone calls you DK, so I probably should just call you DK, right?
I think that'll work for the rest of the show. Most people listening to this will probably know me as DK. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. So how did you find your way into the podcast space?
I originally found I actually always like to tell people I'm probably the first person you ever met to sell streaming radio before Pandora existed. Back at college, I was selling our web-based, college-based streaming radio station for Penn State, and you could listen to a football game. But I came back to it in 2016 when I started selling programmatic audio. I was working with a company called AdsWiz, who's now owned by SXM Media, and iHeart to monetize a lot of the inventory flowing through their ecosystem. And so, yeah, I've been in the business now about 9 years, give or take.
Yeah, awesome. What I love about your experience is that you understand the podcast space super well, but you also understand the audio space and streaming audio. And I find that a lot of people in the podcast space have really just worked in podcasting and don't kind of have, external knowledge. Do you feel like that has helped you to just understand the broader audio kind of landscape?
Yeah, I think we have to remember, at least on the monetization side, and creators as well. We are in the content creation and media monetization space. A lot of marketers and creators really don't necessarily think about the platform or the medium, the format, right? So I think my experience in digital, in television, in radio, in all of these different areas of the media and advertising landscape has enabled me to be, really successful and kind of think about the podcast space specifically in a multifaceted approach, right? As opposed to just kind of the way it's developed, over the past couple of years.
So I'm really curious about, learning more about Mission Media and why you founded that. I'm really curious about the name though. Like, I love that it has mission in it. And I was curious if that was significant.
100%. Mission was the most important element, right? Our goal is to enable independent voices and creators. I think we're living in a world where media in general is being gobbled up by big tech and a handful of large organizations. And I think that that's a problem for a democracy and society, right? So the reason we created Mission Media specifically was because we had a group of podcasters across a number of different, both independent and through networks, that needed representation, right? And our goal was really to empower them to tell their stories and to talk with their audiences and not have any type of interference in an editorial capacity, right? So we founded Mission with the purpose of driving. We still think brands can have a lot of impact working with these individual people, even if they don't have editorial control, right? So our goal was really to enable them to drive influence through independent voices, right? And give them full editorial control of their shows. And so that's how the company started, right? It is really, empowering folks to tell their stories in a nutshell. And that is our mission, right? And really, and work with them to get the revenue they need to continue to pursue this as a career, right? Not just a hobby.
Yeah. And you really come from the programmatic side of things. So I feel like often on this show, we talk a lot about host-read ads. Obviously, there's so much power in host-read ads, but there's a lot of scalability and opportunity in programmatic. And your company leans into monetization through programmatic exclusively.
100%, not exclusively, but as a
Okay.
predominant method of monetization.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do take on direct deals, host read or pre-recorded spots, but our primary model is using programmatic buying, which really just enables the marketer or brand or ad agency to execute the media campaign on their side and have more control over things like the time it airs, the frequency of the ads, the audience that they're targeting, the shows themselves. And that's allowed us to scale quickly, to add on a lot of new shows, to add on a lot of new brands and partners and really be able to get the best bang buck for our clients, right? Because we have the buyers competing effectively for each ad slot that's available, right? So we
Mhm.
put it up for an auction, and then multiple buyers come in and bid for that space, so we can optimize the yield or the value that each show gets, the CPM, right? That
Yeah.
each show.
I mean, I have to ask, and maybe it's a little too early in the interview to ask this, but like, what kind of CPMs are we seeing for programmatic? Because I think that the bulk, at least in the podcast space, of creators see what is funneling down to them through like maybe Span or maybe through Task, through Art 19, and so. I feel like what actually lands in the creator's lap is very different from what the advertiser is paying. And so I do think that sometimes pricing can get lost in conversation or maybe lost in what tier we're talking about. But what CPMs are you looking at right now?
No, I think you're right. And look, the CPMs are in the teens, right? Ultimately,
Hmm.
for I think one of the things to keep in mind about most pod or many podcasters, not most, but many podcasters should have a balance of direct and programmatic, right? Or
Hmm.
dynamic ad insertion spots. So you can include your direct host read ads, okay, and charge a premium for those, and also create incremental space that run before, in the middle, or after the show, right? And at natural ad points that you're not reading, where you can drive incremental revenue using the programmatic slots. So
Hmm.
but generally, there is a pretty significant variance. I've seen certain shows get single digits, and I've seen certain shows get in the 20s, but that's generally where you're going to fall in that teen range,
Hmm.
uh, between $12 and $18, somewhere like that for CPM.
It really does also depend on how much targeting that advertiser is doing, right? When we say, hey, we've got a really broad target, then the rate can be a bit lower. But as we put on more and more kind of qualifications for the audience we're reaching, generally we're going to see an increase in that investment, at least on the part of the advertiser, right?
That's right. Yep. So there's a couple of different factors that have an impact on the overall yield and the CPMs, right? Certainly the amount of targeting that you mentioned, whether it's geographic targeting, could be a big factor actually, right? So if an advertiser is focused on a specific zip code or state or DMA, right, they're more likely to pay higher for that. Behavioral targeting as well, right? So if they're using data or audience, however, the actual cost of the data will take away from the CPM they're willing to pay. So that actually can have a negative impact too.
Mhm.
Using data is not always more effective in driving up yield, right? At least for the creator, right?
Interesting.
It may be for the advertiser, it may make their cost more, but that money doesn't always flow back to again, the show. But geo generally does. If you have, for example, if you have a very large audience specific market and there's advertisers who want to be there, that can, be really beneficial because geo targeting is free by and
Hmm.
large, right?
Hmm.
Cost of operating infrastructure. Other things that can have an impact, whether they're contextual, right? Certain verticals, we see healthcare, business, B2B, right? Generate very high yield, sports as well, for sure, right? That's going to generate pretty much higher yields than some other categories like spirituality or true crime, for example, because there's a lot of scale there, right? So you can kind of use that to commoditize a lot of the creators, even though the content's great, right? And really
Hmm.
good, well thought out. Unfortunately, when there's a lot of competition for that same impression, that lowers rates, obviously, right? So those are a couple factors. The other big thing is actually the brands themselves, right?
Mm.
So certain verticals are willing to pay more. Again, double click on the B2B vertical, right? We see those, businesses pay a significantly higher CPM for shows that are endemic to their categories, right? Versus a CPG product or a more, mainstream mass audience, right? So they'll buy a lot of impressions, but they won't pay a lot for them, right? Like the biggest advertiser, P&G or Verizon or whatever, spending billions of dollars, but unfortunately, their goal is frankly a spray and pray approach for the most part, right? Where they want to reach as many people as low as cost as possible. So
Mhm.
being a little bit more specific in the brands that we want on the show from programmatic can also help increase that yield
Hmm.
significantly.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love the idea of contextual targeting. And what I like most about it is that we're not just talking about upcoming episodes. I think kind of back in the day, advertisers would come and say, "Oh, well, I have this certain product, and are you doing an episode that's around that product? Like, I want to be included in that." And now with contextual targeting, it's so easy to go back through the full catalog of episodes and say, "Oh, we know in this episode, maybe they address a certain topic, and we want to have an ad in that episode because of that." And it sounds like you're really able to leverage through AI and the different technologies that have been created to do more of that contextual targeting. How often are advertisers actually doing that? Or is that something that we're talking about more than it's actually being practiced?
That's a great question. And there's a lot in that question. So, first of all, I think leveraging back catalog to increase product or inventory,
Hmm.
everyone should be doing that, period, right? There's no reason not to make your old catalog monetizable through programmatic now, right? It's a fairly low lift and it creates an annuity from a revenue perspective, right? You put it on,
Hmm.
you set it up. So I love that idea. Then doing it and enabling contextualization of those units is going to get you that better yield that we just talked about, right? So having the proper IB categories classified, and that's kind of step one or contextual 1.0, which
Hmm.
is through the Apple podcast categories, right? It was like there's like 19 of them, I think, in the parent, and then over 100 different child categories, right? So properly labeling those, and then the next step is the Internet Advertising Bureau's categories of contextualization, right? Which will give buyers in programmatic more options. Because remember that most programmatic buyers are coming from a digital display or video background, where categorizations are much different than in podcasting. And so they have a lot more granularity in the context of the text on a website that they're focused
Hmm.
on. And so making sure we're considering our content in the eyes of the Internet Advertising Bureau. Then comes contextual 3.0, where we are today, and you just brought up, which is using artificial intelligence to actually listen to the transcripts of shows, draw out keywords and phrases and be able to target that in real time, right? So that ad breaks can actually dynamically pass signals based on the content versus you having to manually label them, which is what we're doing in versions 1.0 and 2.0. So
Hmm.
now, as opposed to you manually classifying your categories, which you should still do, right? When we have the right AI transcription technology included, we can pass in the bid request. That's what Programmatic's doing. We're putting our impression out into the ether and people are bidding on it, right? So in that request is information about where that ad's going to run, the location, right?
Hmm.
Maybe the user, right? The mobile ID of the phone, potentially, not always in podcasting, right? And the content, right? And so if we can use AI to properly pass a more granular AI, granular contextual category, we're going to get more requests coming through most likely and better match rates and performance for the brand, who's going to increase then ultimately the yield. So that's a big thing we are focused on at Mission, right? Is getting a lot more granular in the categories so that way we can have more relevant ads in the breaks that we've already created and more tailored to that listener or the conversation that's happening. So it's an evolution, right? And I think that it's really important to work with partners who understand this, right? Because things are changing quickly, right? With this new, with the variety of AI tools that are available, frankly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I already kind of commented on in the interview is that you aren't just dealing with podcasts. So, I love that at Mission Media, you are selling across podcasts, streaming audio, CTV, social media channels. So, you're really doing a lot in terms of reach. And as we all should pretty well know, many other mediums are much more advanced in their programmatic tactics, as you even just alluded to. So I guess I'm really curious, how can we in the podcast industry learn from these different channels and how they've leveraged programmatic? And what does that look like for us to look at that and take and learn and apply?
Yeah, there's a lot we can learn there. I love this question as well. Thank you. I mean, in addition to the mediums you mentioned, we're also monetizing across the websites of the podcasts and the creators,
Mm, nice.
newsletters. Okay.
And
So,
newsletters, even with
yeah,
programmatic.
100%. Yeah,
Nice.
exactly. So, one of the challenges in media buying historically, particularly at the agencies, not necessarily with brands, but with the agencies,
Hmm.
is that they're very format specific. Okay. They want to buy podcasts, they want to buy websites, they want to buy social, right? They want to buy search, right?
Hmm.
That's how, agencies have aligned their business models to be successful and scale and grow, which is all fine and well. But for creators and brands, that kind of creates a problem because brands just want results and creators want to create and distribute content, hopefully in as many destinations as they can. And if they're not, I highly encourage them to start, right? Like creating a podcast is great, but why wouldn't you also put that on your website? You don't just have to put it on Apple and Spotify and iHeart or TuneIn, right? 100% you should have your own website and be distributing it there. Your own, your first party assets, own and operate. 100% you should get your listeners to sign up and you can send them a newsletter, whether it's daily, weekly, or even monthly, with the
Mhm.
back catalog of some of your top interviews or shows or whatever it might be. 100% you should put a video camera in front of your podcast now and be distributing it on YouTube and Spotify and potentially fast free ad supported television stations, right? And so, the challenge, though, still today, and one of the things Mission is solving for specifically, is enabling the ad tech infrastructure to monetize automatically or programmatically, right? Because programmatic in many respects is, from a creator standpoint, automatic monetization,
Mhm.
right? Those infrastructures. So with, for example, on our website, right, our creators' websites, we're using the Google suite of products, GAM 360,
Mhm.
right? Whereas in our podcast, we use Simplecast as our hosting platform and the AdsWiz suite of products to monetize the podcasts in there. In video, we work with companies like Freewheel and Publica, who you may know. Freewheel is a Comcast company.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of different technology that needs to be implemented today to enable that monetization across programmatic monetization across the different formats. And which is a lot of paperwork and a lot of negotiation. So we've set up a lot of those MSAs. And I think definitely having a partner that understands those so we can take the learnings across the different technologies and implement them is really important. But I would also say the most important thing, though, putting all that kind of noise aside for a second, is getting this content, in as many destinations. And as you know, and I think you're kind of alluding to, right? Like we're seeing a big trend in podcasting today with video, which is great, but I don't think it should stop there. Like I said, it's creators, the more places that they can have a relationship with their audience, with their listeners, the better, and the more powerful and the more, bulletproof, if you will, they will be as a creator and, in
Mhm.
the economy moving forward.
Well, and I'm a huge proponent of audio, and I feel like I'm, constantly beating that drum of the power of audio, and it's there. But I totally agree with you. And I also think that we have to look at it from a consumer's perspective, right? I think that sometimes we get so industry focused that, we're looking at the business side of things, or we're looking at, this is our industry, and the consumer doesn't care what industry you're in, right? Like the consumer wants to consume great content. And if you're putting out great content and you're meeting them where they're at, then they're going to support you and they're going to be your fans and be your audience. And so I do think as a content creator, I believe content creators have two jobs. Number one, they need to create good content and they need to find that format that lights them up, right? I mean, we could all sit here and come up with a huge list of all the different places where you could create content. And if you absolutely hate TikTok, then you probably shouldn't be on TikTok, right? I do think as a creator, you need to find what lights you up that's going to excite you to create that content. But then you also really do need to find out where your audience is. And, if you are trying to create content for an audience that isn't really there or isn't as engaged, you might find that pivoting to a different channel is going to be very powerful for you as a creator because you're going to be able to grow your audience much more quickly. I have a podcaster who's been on QVC for years and years, and she started a podcast that was just audio and it really didn't go anywhere. And then she added YouTube and she has a huge YouTube following, right? Like she was able to find her audience in YouTube that she wasn't able to find in audio. And she's still doing both, which is great. But I do think it's important as a creator to figure out what lights you up and also where your audience is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And listen, from my perspective, as a consumer, as a listener, as a media junkie, which is why I got into this space in the first place, and because I love consuming pretty much media all day long, right? In all types. I'm a huge advocate for more investment in audio from a brand's
Mhm.
perspective. And I will actually go back to my earlier point, which is the reason there's not more investment in audio is because the agencies weren't properly set up for it and they were
Hmm.
wasting all their money on TV and now social. And we've kind of got leapfrogged in many respects. So I absolutely think that audio is still one of the most powerful formats for communicating messages and ideas and having conversations, period, bar stop, right? Full stop. And I think that creators should absolutely be using the format and leaning into it. Having said that, I respect that they're putting a lot of time and energy into this. And so, if it's not the channel that they're thriving in, doesn't mean they shouldn't ignore it. It doesn't mean they should stop. It just means they need to try other environments, like you said, as well. Whether that's putting a camera and going onto YouTube or writing or, doing other types of ways to connecting. Maybe it's live events, right? We see
Right.
that as successful for a lot of creators as well. Writing a book, okay?
Hmm.
And so look at I'm reading 10% Happier right now. Look at that podcast, right? That was a book first, and then it
Yeah.
became a podcast,
Yeah.
okay? By the way, great book, great show,
Oh
and
yeah. I've read the book. Yeah,
yeah,
it's great.
I'm,
And
I know
listened
I'm
to
a
the show.
little late here, by the way, but I am reading it right now, and I'm really enjoying that. So I think that's the main takeaway here
Hmm.
is that as a creator it's particularly if you're like a social creator, because we see a lot of those influencers today, get involved in podcasts, start a podcast. You really still should if you haven't yet. And if you have started a podcast and it's not working, my suggestion maybe is try distributing it more than just Apple and Spotify, frankly.
Hmm.
Get that camera front, distribute it on YouTube, distribute it in other destinations that we just talked about. Because I think that, having that multifaceted approach and multiple ways to connect with audiences is just really important to find your stride.
Yeah, I agree. So, why do you think? I know you mentioned that we kind of got leapfrogged in the audio, and I always think audio is an old format, right? Like radio has been around forever. I can't remember the date. I don't know if you remember, but I mean, it's been around forever, right? So, audio advertising isn't a new thing. And sometimes I think, and I used to sell radio ads back in the day. I feel like sometimes agencies don't see it as being this interesting, sexy, new like thing to do because it's like, oh, it's just audio. And I think that, when we're looking at the digital age and all the metrics that come with digital and the ability to track and track click-throughs and all of that, it feels so much more substantial. And audio feels like it's more difficult to track. Maybe it doesn't have all those same metrics, but the technology really has increased to a place where you can see the acquisition of new customers. We can create KPIs for audio campaigns. They perform all day long. I go back to like this idea that like obviously if DR brands are advertising in droves, that means there's something there. Why did we get skipped over and why does audio not get the attention that it should from agencies?
Yeah, that's, I mean, a critical, really important questions, right? So first of all, fully aligned that from a performance, it's the probably best bang for your advertising dollar, period. Again, podcasting specifically, but audio in general, right?
Hmm.
You're still going to see a better ROI than many other channels. I think the reason is because if we go back to the name podcast, right? Inherently in the name of the format was the specific distribution technology channel that was not set up for monetization, period.
Sure.
Apple is it, that was where the name came from, right? The iPod. And Apple was not an ad-supported company. It's a tech company that wanted to engage their, create more customers. And by the way, Apple's been wildly successful, right? Because if you think
Hmm.
about 2000, when my cousin created one of the first podcasts, Robert Krulewich, NPR and Radiolab, that was still like a novelty, right? So I think part of the issue was in television and that was evolving. In cable, it was set up for the purpose of monetization, right?
Hmm.
Television was made, at least cable television was made more so for ad sales. Ted Turner, who's created CNN, was an ad sales guy by trade. He started in billboards,
Yeah.
okay? And then he made the network to sell more ads.
Right.
Podcasts were created to tell a story, right? To
Right.
listeners, right? So for better or worse, like we did the right thing by the audiences and we still are, but in some respects that we didn't necessarily think about how to, focus on getting brands involved first. So I think as it evolved, websites focused on selling ads, right? They were
Hmm.
developed for the purpose of selling ads, right? That's why you have, issues in digital media where people are like, oh, banner ads, these are so ineffective because, of course, they're ineffective because they're screaming at you, right?
Mhm.
And the publishing was a secondary kind of thought, right? And so, social, if you think about it, really came in to connect with people. That was its primary form. I mean, now we
Sure.
know now it's there just to sell ads too, unfortunately,
Yeah.
right? Why that experience is so tainted on Instagram or X or wherever you might go, even LinkedIn in many respects today, was becoming just so cluttered with, people just trying to, add you and then sell you stuff, right? Whereas, that podcast format is still pure. So again, I think this was really just a function of the commercialization, and our format was there to tell stories, and
Mhm.
advertising has always been second, which is really good for the brands. It's really good for the listeners, and the brands have been able to benefit. And I think that the agencies, in many respects, the major holding companies specifically that control the vast majority of ad spend failed to focus on it and adapt. And, you have a lot of independent creators. Another thing, not major media companies who are spending the investment to necessarily get in front of those holding companies because they
Right.
are individuals and smaller companies and small business. I mean, we are the heartblood or of society in many aspects, certainly in the United States, but internationally as well. Independent operators, right? Not just big conglomerates that really are effective at getting their way, whether that's through,
Mhm.
lobbying in Washington,
Mhm.
D.C. or lobbying at major holding companies for ad spend. Those are a number of kind of the things that have held us back. Doesn't mean that the format's not more impactful. In fact, it is. And probably
Mhm.
because of those, it's just a better advertising medium. It's just, I guess we
Right.
need a PR campaign.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, Tom Webster had said that at one point that like, podcasting needs better PR. And I think that you're absolutely right. And even like if we look at companies like Sirius or iHeart or Audio Boom, or I mean, just some of these bigger companies, they're still really like radio first in a lot of sense, right? Where it's like, yeah, maybe they're bringing podcasts into these holding companies, but they're not podcast first companies. They might be audio first companies. But I think that that's a really, really good point. And I know even, at True Native Media, my company, we've tried the holding companies and we're constantly knocking at that door. And yeah, we've made a lot of progress, which is great. But we're a 12-person team, right? Like we don't have the dollars, we don't have the influence that a huge conglomerate has. And yeah, that's really interesting. I do like to what you mentioned earlier that at the holding companies, they do silo everything so much. And I find that it can be really tricky to say, like, where does podcasting fit? Does it fit in in the category of social selling or buying, or does it fit in audio, or where exact? I mean, we have companies that say that it's, considered non-digital, so it's like you really don't know exactly where it all fits and things. That can be a challenge as well.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. One of the things that's made me successful across my career, first at Audiology and at Cats, now most recently at Mission, is that we've really gone after those digital display and digital CTV and video dollars, right? So
Mm.
as opposed to focusing really on the podcast agencies, for example, or focusing on the radio agencies, for
Hmm.
example, we've gone right at the heart of the digital dollars, not the social either, just to be clear, not the
Hmm.
influencer, but those digital data-driven dollars. And that has enabled us to carve out a bit of a niche there and encourage them to think about podcasting as a digital format and audio in
Right.
general, digital format, and it should be included in digital media plans. And that
Love
has
it.
enabled us to have growth. And I think, frankly, I would take credit and say that it's enabled the whole ecosystem to grow. A lot of what
Hmm.
Spotify has done has mimicked that approach as well, where they're going after the digital dollars as well. And I
Hmm.
think they've had a lot of success, not necessarily with Span, but with their streaming products specifically, their music streaming products specifically.
Yeah.
So that has been wildly helpful. I think you're right, though, knowing that it kind of has not had a home has been a challenge. The other thing you addressed, which I'm going to double click on, is the notion that a lot of the podcast firms came from radio, and radio historically actually was driven by local buying, right?
Absolutely.
Radio really, as a business, even still today, is based on community-based selling, which is really powerful and important. The challenge with podcasting is that inherently most shows are national, right? So you have local sellers selling a
Yep.
national product. So
Yep.
those two things have never really aligned, which is why programmatic and going after digital for podcasting has been so successful for me, at least,
Hmm.
whereas, these traditional kind of radio firms are struggling to kind of adapt that. So again, going back to an idea we talked about a while ago, if you can create content that has a really big following in a local community, that's going to probably could potentially do really well from a yield perspective if you get the right team in place to monetize that.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I really feel like CTV to me seems like it is so similar to podcasts in the way that people can buy and kind of just from a programmatic perspective. Do you see a lot of similarities there?
Yeah, massive. I mean, in so
Yeah.
many respects. I think the biggest similarity, though, in the context of ad tech and what we do in programmatic and even with AI, is the fact that addressability on the user level or the listener level is the same. So, what that means is that in podcasting, it's also a very private environment, actually, as a
Hmm.
listener, right? You're not giving away a lot of your personal data, which is a positive, right? You give away your location generally
Sure.
and what we call the user agent, so the device you're listening on, but you don't give your personally identifiable information. So most of the time, advertisers don't know that it's me who's listening, but what they are able to determine is that my household IP address, right?
Hmm.
So they do know that I'm listening at this such and such IP address, and that's associated with an address, right? Or a general location. It could be it could be a mobile IP address, right? So a cell phone tower or a commercial IP address, right? And that's also how targeting is done in CTV, right?
Hmm.
So connected television, because it's inherently not one-to-one, right? It's at the household level. You have a television in your home, you don't carry it around with you. It's also done at a household level. And so a lot of that data application and targeting and contextualization is the same in CTV as it is in
Hmm.
podcasting, which is, by the way, another reason why podcasters should be going after digital CTV buyers to sell their media. I think also the other thing that's happening in CTV is a lot of independent development and content creation, right? You don't have to be a huge media company to create a connected television station or a fast channel, a free ad-supported television
Hmm.
station. And we're seeing an abundance of new CTV channels. So that's really cool. The barriers to entry have been dramatically lowered versus traditional broadcast television, and of course, and linear cable TV as well.
Hmm.
So there's more opportunities as creators to get in the door, which of course we know in podcasting is the case, but in CTV as well.
Do people actually watch fast channels? I've been really curious, like what the audience size
Yeah,
is.
I think so. I think what we're seeing actually now is that the gatekeepers of CTV, so the device manufacturers and the operating system manufacturers,
Mm.
are defaulting to fast or O&O channels
Mm.
versus the cable, all right? So it used to be when you turn on your television, you got your local broadcast stations, right? When it first came out, you 457, whatever it is, 2457, right? Then people got cable boxes, and when you would turn it on, it would turn on to whatever channel you left it on, whatever cable or broadcast station the remote was left on, right? Now, right, when we turn on our television, right, we're using the operator's device, okay,
Mhm.
Roku, Google OS, Samsung, right? And those are defaulting to their environments. So if you
Right.
have Samsung, it defaults to Samsung OS, right? And that gives you all of their, channels and fast channels and apps, right?
Mhm.
Same thing with, Google OS or many of the other ones as well that use third-party operating systems. So, like Heinz or Vizio, whatever has their own OS, and so that's enabled significant diversion from that cable operators right into the connected television and fast
Mhm. Mhm.
streaming. Well,
Yeah.
but I do think, yeah, historically, for a long time, it was not necessarily the case, and now they kind of smartened up and said, "Hey, why are we defaulting to the Comcast
Totally. Yeah.
or cable visions of the world when we can have our own ecosystem and bring
Right.
creators directly in?"
Yeah. That's a really good point. So, I know we need to start wrapping it up. What would you say is kind of the future of programmatic in podcasting specifically?
I think it's important that every podcaster have a programmatic strategy,
Hmm.
right? Because there's a couple things. Say you had the best sales team ever and you were the most in-demand show ever, you can sell so many host reads before you start to cannibalize those rates, but you can add in, and if you're not going to cannibalize listenership too, you can add in unlimited amount of pre and mid-roll spots, right? Assuming that your listeners never go away, right? Which we don't want to take them for granted. but let's just assume that, they came back no matter what. You always have more product to sell and you won't
Mhm.
be able to manually support that. So you need to be able to have that backfill in place if that's what you want to do. Now, let's say you didn't want to have a sales team for direct reads. You can go to have programmatic. You can set your floor prices. You can do your own deals and kind of start to make that happen as well. I still think you need somebody to help you with that, most likely. As a
Mhm.
creator, you should focus on your content and you should have a team in place to do
Mhm.
that monetization. But every team has the really capability now to be able to do it and be successful, frankly.
Mhm.
So I think the future is more availability, more supply entering the programmatic space, and more demand. We're hearing
Mhm.
from all the major demand side platforms, the DSPs that buy programmatically, they want more audio, they want more
Right.
podcasts. Every single one. Nobody's like, yeah, we're over this now. No, that's not the case.
Right.
So there's still a huge amount of appetite there, and I do see this format growing pretty significantly, doubling and tripling at least for the next couple of years
Mhm.
by way of programmatic dollars. So I see a lot of growth for programmatic podcasting in a nutshell on both the supply and demand side.
Mhm. Mhm. Awesome. Well, DK, thank you so much for being on the show. If people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, add me on LinkedIn, please. Follow us, Mission Media as well. We just sent a launch announcement out at the beginning of this month. And you can email me at david@missionmedia.ai and happy to connect one-on-one for more. So
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show.
awesome. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. I love to talk about that intersection between programmatic and podcasting and all of the opportunities that we have to learn from others who have gone before us. So thanks for listening to this episode, and we will catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.